Hello and welcome everyone to this online conference. People are still rolling in, but the curve is slightly flattening, so I decided to start off. I'm glad that you're joining today from wherever you may be to learn more about different ways to bring down methane emissions along the entire supply chain of fossil gas. My name is Lisa Tostado, and I'm honored to be moderating today's event, which is under the auspices of the member of the European Parliament, Jutta Paulus. I myself work for the EU office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, that is the German Green political foundation that is affiliated with the Greens that are represented in Germany's federal parliament. And this event is jointly co-hosted by the Deutsche Umwelthilfe, Environmental Action Germany, that is a nonprofit environmental and consumer protection association. And I'm really happy to cooperate again on this topic. Already last year, we had a series of events with Professor Robert Howarth, who is a lead scientist when it comes to understanding methane emissions from fossil gas. And earlier this year, we also had an event to present a market survey on how the gas industry tackles methane emissions already today or not. And you're welcome to watch the recordings of these past events. Before we dive in, just a few technical remarks, even though I think that we are all fairly used to using Zoom by now. The chat is disabled for the participants. However, we do have the questions and answers tool open. So if you have questions to the panelists, please feel free to post them as of now as they speak. And you can also like other people's questions. And in that way, they appear higher up on the list. And I will make sure to forward them later on when we move on to the panel discussion. This event is also being recorded, so you can also watch it again or share the link with colleagues that couldn't be able to attend. With regards to the content, let's dive in. So methane. Methane is the second biggest contributor to climate change after carbon dioxide. And while it stays in the atmosphere for a shorter period of time, it is over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year time period, which is the period that we should actually look at when we speak about sticking to the Paris Agreement. The European Commission published a methane strategy last year, and it focuses on the three major emitters of methane: agriculture, waste, and energy. But only for energy, we can expect concrete legislation still this year. And the ENVI committee, so the Environment Committee of the European Parliament, adopted a report on the methane strategy just last week. And the entire Parliament will vote on that in the week of October 18th. So this event comes at a very timely week to bring different new instruments up on the agenda. And I'm sure that Jutta Paulus will also tell us more about the political context and where we are at. At the same time, the US is also drafting their own regulation to tackle methane emissions. And there has been news about a global methane pledge to be announced during COP26 later in November in Glasgow. So this is the time at which the DOH, the Deutsche Umwelthilfe, commissioned a study to explore ways to incentivize necessary measures to abate methane emissions arising from gas production, both in the EU, but also gas imports into the EU. Something that is kind of similar to the European Emission Trading Scheme and the CBAM, but also different. And we will hear more about that during this event. With regards to the program, we will first have a few opening remarks by the member of European Parliament, Jutta Paulus, to provide the political context. And we then have Caroline Schenwitt from the Forum Ökologisch-Soziale Marktwirtschaft, Green Budget Germany, who will present some key results of the study, who she was a main author for. And then we have comments by Konstantin Zerger from the Deutsche Umwelthilfe and Mark Brownstein from the Environmental Defense Fund, who add in their technical expertise and also their insights from the different geographic regions that they are from. And finally, we have a panel discussion where speakers exchange among themselves, but also pick up your questions. So prepare them as of now. So without further ado, I will now pass the floor to Jutta. She has been a member of the European Parliament since 2019, and she has since been serving on the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, which is also the lead committee for the own initiative report on the methane strategy, which I just talked about. And she was the shadow rapporteur on that file. And she's also a substitute member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, which is the associated committee on the file. So she is a very competent person to tell us a little bit more about the politics behind that. So please, Jutta, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for actually getting this event on the screen, because I'm really glad that the issue of methane emissions now gets an ever-growing platform. We had the International Energy Agency focusing on that. We had an extra chapter in the Ipcc report, in the upcoming Ipcc report, to be very honest, because we only have seen chapter 1 until now. And you have already said a lot about the upcoming vote on the file of the methane INI, which we are very, very glad about, actually, because I think that we have achieved quite a lot, to be very honest, compared to where we come from and compared to where the discussion has been just, let's say, even a year ago. So there has been a lot on this, a lot of progress on this issue, and I'm really glad on that. What did we achieve? Actually, we had a pretty ambitious rapporteur from EPP, who took up a lot of the good amendments which were tabled by the Greens, by Renew, and also by the left, which I didn't expect, to be very honest, at the beginning of the file. I thought, well, let's see what comes out of it, and I wasn't hoping for too much, but at the end, we did achieve quite a bit. So let's see in the single topics. We have, of course, energy. The good news is we're calling for the use of the 20-year time frame of the global warming potential of methane. It's the first time that, although it's only an INI, but there is a call to develop phase-out plans for all fossil fuels, which the Commission should do together with the member states, which is a first in the European Parliament. And I'm really glad that this was achieved at the end of the day. We had an amendment on LNG as a transport fuel, which was passed, because we are very skeptical on that. But what we're seeing in the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation, it's now a regulation. It's not only a directive anymore, it will be a regulation. And so I'm very glad that this amendment passed, because that was also, well, let's say not everyone was happy with this amendment in the shadow meetings. Still, a lot of people do believe that LNG does have a future in a renewable system, which is, of course, well, I will not use such a strong word, but let's say it's not very smart. So I'm really glad that this amendment got passed at the end of the day. And also, I was very glad to see that we improved the text on the legal basis, because up to now the European Commission took as legal basis an article from the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union on the energy market, but we're talking about emissions, so we must we must look that the legal basis is actually shifted to the environmental. And this also was passed, this amendment, also an amendment on the petrochemical industry, which is one of the biggest forcer of oil and gas production nowadays. Also, we improved the text on waste. There was, for example, a phrase calling for support for incineration, which we managed to scrap. We improved a little the text on agriculture. We managed to get a majority to a call for a dietary shift. Our initial proposal was only supported by the left, but we managed to get in a text from the Farm to Fork strategy calling for a dietary shift. And also we got in something on grazing animals, because of course, scrapping methane emissions from agriculture must not mean putting every animal into the stable. This would contradict our beliefs on animal welfare. But we had some quite infamous agri amendments on, well, we must not endanger food security. We should use new genomic techniques to improve methane emissions, a lot of focus on carbon farming and how great agriculture is already at removing CO2. And it was pretty difficult to get at least the worst stuff out of this initiative report. Unfortunately, the amendment on the new genomic techniques remained in there, but it's only a call of, well, we need more research there. It's not like we have to do it. The next steps, well, we will have the vote, as you said, in October at the second plenary week. I do expect that we will get a large majority because it was passed in Envy with a large majority already. And then we will wait for the legislative proposal on MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification of emissions, and also on LDAR, leak detection and repair. And we are also calling in our initiative report that MRV and LDAR rules should be looking not only at what we are doing inside the EU, but also be transferred to imports, so that by the specific deadline, which we did not manage to really put a value on in the NB report, but at least we are saying that these rules should be attributed to imports also, meaning that we need a certification system, and up from a certain period, in a certain period of time, no more imports are allowed to the EU, which are not subject to MRV and LDAR. And that, of course, would mean that we are really having an impact on the global scale, because the EU is one of the biggest gas importers worldwide. And by making our importers adhere to these rules, we would also have an effect on imports to other countries. So that was, in a nutshell, what this INI was all about. And I'm happy to answer any further questions. It's quite a long INI, and probably not everyone has had the opportunity to read it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jutta, for setting the political stage on where we at. And indeed, methane emissions are a very big topic, which is why this particular event also focuses on a very specific question, namely how to combine economic and regulatory options to incentivize that emissions go down both in the EU and also elsewhere, as the EU is a big importer. And we will hear more about that now by Caroline Schlenowit, who is the managing director of the Forum Ökologisch-Soziale Marktwirtschaft, Green Budget Germany, since October 2020. She has a degree in environmental engineering, and she has worked for the past 15 years in the field of energy policy, both strategically as well as implementation focused. And most recently, she led the team for market and system integration of renewable energies at the German Energy Agency. She will now present to us the key results of the study, which I all invite you to download and read in full length after the event. So please, Caroline, which instruments did you consider in your study, and which do you deem most feasible, and why?
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks a lot. I will activate my screen sharing and hope everything goes smoothly here. So could you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen?
Yes, it's all fine.
Okay, great. So implementing a methane pricing model for the EU gas market has been our topic in the study, and I will try to structure my input in a brief introduction, which was already touched to some aspects, so I keep that short. Why is it time to act? Then I'll come to the design proposal in its details, and I will also inform you about some considerations on the implementation that we have conducted, and give some information on the estimated effects of the pricing logic on climate impact, so expected emission reductions, as well as the impact on natural gas prices for consumers and the use of revenues. Very briefly on first, I will make this short too. So we are a small boutique think tank on environmental and financial policies located in Berlin. We have quite some tradition working in the field since 1994. And we are working on more or less all relevant sectors, energy, transport, and agriculture, and provide concepts, ideas for instrument design on the market policy side. So what's here? Yeah. So why is it time to act? We have here a brief info on the climate effectivity that you already mentioned in the opening, Lisa. So why is it so important to reduce methane emissions quickly? They're responsible for 20% of the greenhouse effect globally, which shows why it makes a lot of sense to put priority here. And due to that, due to especially the short-term, the high short-term effect of methane on climate, the reduction of methane emissions is the fastest and most cost-effective way to slow down global heating, because for every kilogram or ton methane saved, you get a lot in return in terms of saved warming effect. And I think an important side note is also to say that 85% of the natural gas that is being consumed in the EU is imported. So that's why we really have to look at this interface between the, let's say, EU internal gas volumes and those which are imported. We see a high variation of methane emissions in intensities in those imports from different countries. We also, that has been mentioned, see a huge variation and uncertainty on the data quality, but we just try to demonstrate, to illustrate the variety that we see in this table that you see on the slide. So if you look at the numbers here, there is more than a factor of 10 difference between the different supplying countries. And that is why we have to look at the situation very closely and also very specifically. And just also to illustrate the problem of measuring and verifying, we do have some satellite data that indicate that leakages of methane in Russia increased by 40% in 2020, presumably because demand was low and so was operation and maintenance. We don't know it. It may not be the right number, but the potential for such an extent of effect, I think, shows enough why we really need to care more here. Also about the product that we import into the EU. What have we looked at? So we reviewed different design options. First of all, a logic very close to the EU ETS CBAM. Sorry, I think you see, I have to get this away. Very close to the EU ETS carbon border adjustment logic, which feels very logical because we have this discussion right now. So we could put one more topic into the basket. And then we looked at more classical instruments like an excise duty, for example, that would work on the consumer side, or an import tax, both instruments that we have in different contexts already in operation and for a long time. I don't have the time to get into the details of our assessment, but by the green squares here, you see the indication which idea scored best in which field. And you also understand by that color code why I will be focusing on the import tax logic in the following. So we decided that this is the most promising tool when it comes to implementation and effectiveness going forward. And I will explain in further detail why. So the idea is to start with a default value, with an import tax and a default value for import volumes based on the average EU methane intensities. That may sound a little irritating because we know that the EU countries perform rather well. But this is let's say, a compromise where to start when we look at the data situation. And we would also propose to start with a rather moderate price level. So this presumably high 500 to 700 euro per ton methane equals to 17 to 23 euro per ton CO2 equivalent. So price levels that we are far beyond in the EU ETS for quite some time by now. But nevertheless would have, we think would have a good impact when we go upstream, and we also propose to focus on upstream emissions in the first phase. Then we have a time, for example, 3 years, where we can or have to work intensively on improving the data quality and collect real world measurement data, increase the price already steadily, and then move to phase 2. where we get from default to the actual measurement values. We further increase the price towards damage cost level. I will come to that later, and also broaden the scope to include transmission, for example, or slippage along the supply chain. So the idea is to phase the pricing logic in, and then amend it by a performance standard to safeguard, as a safeguard, to exclude extraordinarily high methane intensities. We have depicted this here. So the idea of the two tools, if you want, we have here the performance standard and here the price. So the one starting at the moderate level going down quickly, and the other one starting at a rather low level going up quickly. And we think the special value of the performance standard is in the short and medium term, until the price signal gets into really relevant levels, because it sends an unmistakable signal that there is a threshold that cannot be overstepped. And we think it also sets an incentive to adapt measures to reduce methane emissions along the supply chain. And we also think that for the performance standard, the EU methane strategy is a window of opportunity, because it's already being discussed, maybe not intensively. Jutta may be able to comment on that later, but at least it has been in the discussion according to our knowledge. The considerations about the cost, I will try to cover this briefly. So where should the price level be? The price, the goal or target price should look at the abatement cost and at the damage cost. And there, I think, is a very fascinating information. So, well, in general, methane price should be, the price should be higher than the abatement costs to have an effect, but 40% of methane emissions could be reduced without any net costs, according to the International Energy Agency. So this is more or less a zero-sum game at the moment, with methane volumes lost that cannot go into sale versus the cost that abatement would bring. So yeah, this is, I think, a very big trigger to show that any movement on a price, additional price, would certainly have an effect. And also to be said that abatement costs, of course, differ highly for the different regions. When we look at the damage cost, that is the relatively high price level, depending on which global warming potential you look at, especially considering the fact that methane is very climate effective in the short term. We see that the damage cost level is huge. If you remember the 500 to 700 euros equivalent that I mentioned before, if we look here at we are here in the range of several thousands of euros per ton of methane. So I think that's why the incline over time can and should be very steep in order to do justice to the actual climate impact of methane. On the legal feasibility side, the most important factor is Wto compatibility, according to our assessment. And we think that it is feasible to design the instrument in a compatible way. But we also have to point out that we did no in-depth legal check of the proposal. So that is certainly something that needs to be vetted when it comes to the design details. And on the political feasibility, well, obviously we talk about a tax issue, so an unanimous vote is required. On the other hand, the vested interests, at least in the EU, are relatively low when it comes to gases extraction. And there's also precedence. So we already have some countries with a domestic extraction fee. But of course, there's a big but. Depending on the influence on the price level, there are, of course, other political concerns that are also relevant, and that we see in the active discussion already right now, unfortunately. When it comes to emission reductions, so what is the climate impact of the proposal? We refer to a great study that Enervis has done this year. So we totally profit from the work of the colleagues there. And we took their values and coupled it with our proposal. So we might hope to expect an upstream decline in methane emissions at a price level equivalent to 25 euros per ton CO2 equivalent of almost 20%. And if the price goes higher, of up to 50%. And that is without producer abatement response. So this is by just putting a price on it. Obviously, we may expect a producer abatement response. If we consider a relevant abatement response, the numbers go up also quickly, and the variance goes down. So we are at 78 and 79%. These are model values, so don't take them by the number, but a very high decline even at lower price levels because of the measures taken. And that is also this is basically underlining, illustrating what I said before, that actual abatement is not that expensive. And when we look at the price levels here as well, the abatement response is an important input parameter. So we see here that the increase on residential and on industrial gas prices is not unacceptable, let's say. So we are way below 2% in most scenarios, unless we have a very high price with no producer abatement response, which I think is not a realistic option, but one that can be modeled. And there we would get into regions that are certainly of concern for many EU member states. Now, sorry, I have a little delay here. And last but not least, to the use of revenues. The critical WTO compliance requires a use of revenues bound to finance climate policy measures within the EU and outside the EU. And we think both options should be pursued, the one for the EU internal acceptance of the instrument and the other one in order to develop our supply relationships and also get the affected countries on board for the idea, for the system. And there are existing funds and existing financing logics that could be used. I will not go into detail of this because I'm already over my time, but the message basically is it can be done. We can use existing structures. We should. It's also a plea for a diverse use of the revenues. And we think that it could be a kickstart for more sustainable, maybe greener gas supply relationships going forward. And I will conclude with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. As you can tell from the questions and answers section, it has already sparked some interest and some questions, and we will come back to these during the panel discussion. But thank you for already raising different issues around the differences in intensity of methane emissions, the uncertainties, how you came up with the price level, the legal political feasibility. I'm sure that our audience will come up with even more questions around that. We will now start the series of comments, first with Konstantin Zerker, who will speak on behalf of the Deutsche Umwelthilfe, who commissioned that study. He is heading the Energy and Climate Program at Environmental Action Germany, and he has worked a lot on different gas issues. His focus area is climate protection and energy, also in the energy in the building sector, but also the expansion of electricity grids and renewable energies. So, Konstantin, what is your take on the study, and how do you think should methane legislation be addressed more generally speaking?
Thank you very much, and in particular, thank you very much to you, Caroline, for presenting the study in such a comprehensive way. It's complicated stuff, but it's important that we talk about that. I have three main comments, one being why we actually did commission the study. The second, what's the key takeaway from our point of view at Deutsche Umwelthilfe? And then lastly, what needs to happen next from our point of view. And to start with the first point, why we actually commissioned this study, we already talked why methane emissions are so important to meet our climate targets, so I'm not going to repeat that. But obviously, we as an environmental NGO want to see strong action, and we want to see instruments how actually emissions can be reduced. And although we have an intense debate on this on a European level, our feeling is that when we look on the national level in Germany, that this debate is missing. And maybe it's not only missing in Germany, but also in other European member states. So this is why we are working on that as a German environmental NGO. And it's part of the reason why we commissioned the study, because we obviously want to change that, and we need to change that as well. We know that we have emissions also on a national level, and it's probably more than industry tries to tell us. One example is measurements we conducted this summer, where we had a look at some parts of the German gas infrastructure and found in a number of cases emissions. We're able to document them, and we're also able to prove that they are not fed into national inventories. So we are really concerned that actually there are more emissions, and that we not only need to see actions to reduce them, but we need to find them in the first place. So the problem is there, but of course it's coming from all along the supply chain. It's not just a German problem, or maybe the least a German problem, because you already mentioned the numbers, Caroline. 85% of the gas consumed in Europe is coming from third countries outside the European Union. So we have to include them, and we have to include those sources into our legislation as well, because these are the main sources for methane emissions European consumers and the European economy is causing. Which is or will be a complicated task, but which makes it even more important to start to act on that, and which makes it even more important to include this into our legislative proposals and to include it into our strategies as well. And that's, from my point of view, a key shortcoming or major shortcoming of the European methane strategy, because we might see good proposals, we might have seen improvements during the process, as Jutta has pointed out, and I also acknowledge that it's going to be a big showcase and others will follow the example. So it's important to do all of that. But then on the other hand, I think we need more direct measures also to include sources and emissions from third countries if we really want to be effective in what we are trying to do here. So there are two major shortcomings from my point of view in the strategy. One is that third countries are not included in a sufficient way. And then secondly, that we are not talking about direct reduction measures, which come on top of LDAR, which is important, but I definitely think we need more. And that's the reason behind our work. And that's also the reason why we thought it would be good to cooperate here with Green Budget Germany to come up with a study showing that we actually have more options at hand, that we are able to broaden the European debate. And that, of course, that's a specific German perspective, that we are also able to bring it on a German agenda, in particular in upcoming coalition talks when a new government is forming its new program. So that's the key rationale behind this. Second comment is what's the key takeaway from our point of view, and that's mainly that it's actually possible to come up with something additional to what we are debating right now on a European level. And I already said that it is really important what we have on the table, but again, we need more. And we think that we need some innovation when it comes to the regulation of methane. We can talk about all those technical issues that are connected with LDAR, and we also need to talk about MRV, and we have to improve the database. That's for sure. It will be a basis for a lot of things, and also for our proposal here. But we also need to talk about the right political instruments, and this is where actually economic instruments and the idea of a pricing mechanism for methane comes in. I think it can work quite well if it's done well, and FUS has shown that it's actually possible to implement such a pricing mechanism. And I think it's particularly important also to combine it with a strong regulation when it comes to a performance standard, because in that way we can, on the one hand, guarantee efficiency, talking about the economic instrument and the pricing mechanism. And then on the other hand, we are also going to have a very effective instrument that's ensuring, and that's the performance standard, that we are actually going to reduce emissions in a way that it is compliant with the climate targets and the climate needs we have. So that's something I find really important, and we are always intrigued to talk about the efficiency of things. But as we need to stop climate change, we also need to talk about effectiveness. And in this proposal, and that's something I want to highlight, is that the performance standard actually plays a very strong role. It's really important, and at least from our point of view, a performance standard at the end of the day should tell producers whether they are allowed to sell gas in the EU or not. So if you are not complying with the climate compatible level of methane emissions, then your gas can't simply be traded in Europe anymore, which is probably the strongest measure we can take. So that's my key takeaway, that we need this combination, efficiency and effectiveness, and that it is actually possible. What needs to happen next? My third and final comment is that, of course, we need to see strong European regulation. So all those amendments Jutta has mentioned in the beginning, we need to see them becoming actual legislation on European level. That's a first step, which is something we need to acknowledge, but we will need more. So we need to have another debate about how we can actually tackle the 85% of the gas that's coming from outside Europe. We need to have and find instruments which we can use to reduce methane emissions coming from those sources. And I very much hope that with the proposal FUS is putting forward today, we can contribute to this debate, because I think it's going to be key if we want to be effective and if we want to achieve climate targets, that actually this is going to be part of any future debate, and then this will also translate into further legislative action, of course. Last point I want to mention is that it's key to reduce methane emissions. I think we all agree on that here in this meeting. But I want to add that at the same time, when we look at the energy sector, we shall not forget that we also need to talk about the gas exit and gas phase out in Europe, which would be the strongest measure to actually reduce methane emissions from the energy sector. And that's my final point.
Thank you, Konstantin, for these comments and also for recalling the rationale behind that study and the gaps that you identified in the methane strategy, most notably the missing, how it fails to really address emissions from third countries and clear reduction measures that would actually have an impact in the more short term as well. Speaking about third countries and non-EU countries, that brings me now to Mark Brownstein, our panelist, speaking to us from the US. So thank you for getting up early for us. Mark is the Senior Vice President of Energy at the Environmental Defense Fund, and he's also a member of EDF's executive team. So he leads EDF's energy program globally with a focus on halting the rise of global oil and gas emissions. And he also teaches classes on energy policies. I'm really glad that we have you here with us today. So I'd be interested in hearing your insights, what you think about that suggested import tax and also the performance standard. Has the EDF also thought about such instruments or similar implementation tools? And what is your perspective from the US in terms of legislation also on the end of the US?
Well, so first of all, Lisa, thank you to you and your colleagues for hosting this event and for inviting me to participate with with an outside European perspective on all of this. And let me just say that this conversation is incredibly timely. Earlier this month, we received the latest science from the Ipcc. And what that science makes incredibly clear is that we have no hope of staying below 1.5 degrees C if we don't rapidly decarbonize our economy and simultaneously address reducing methane emissions. That what the science is telling us is that we need to do both. And this is new because up until this point, I think so much of the effort has gone into focusing on decarbonization that the powerful role that methane plays in driving warming in the near term has sort of gotten a little lost. And I think now makes it clear that we need to be doing both. I think the other reason why this conversation is incredibly timely, of course, is because the European Union, in partnership with the United States, is in the process of trying to enlist all the countries of the world in a significant commitment to reduce methane emissions across the economy. So while we are talking here today about what we can do to reduce oil and gas methane emissions, I think it is incredibly important that we remember that the fight to reduce methane emissions is about all sources of methane, whether from agriculture or landfills or the oil and gas industry. We're focused on the oil and gas industry first and foremost because all the data shows that this is the place where we can make the biggest progress the soonest. It is truly the low-hanging fruit. And so that's why we focus so much on it. And I think that's why European Commission and its methane strategy is right to highlight the importance of getting after this first, but I don't want it to be lost that we need to have a comprehensive strategy to deal with methane across the economy. Third point I'd like to make, of course, is that as this discussion begins to highlight, commitments are nice. The fact that the EU and the US are trying to get commitments around the world is important, but action is far more important at the end of the day. And that's why this conversation and this report is so important because what it's highlighting is the fact that particularly in Europe, Europe's responsibility for its impact for global methane emissions cannot be fully addressed simply by doing measures that apply to domestic operations, whether that's domestic production or pipelines or city utility systems. That in fact, Europe's biggest methane footprint when it comes to oil and gas is related to the amount of gas that's imported into the European Union. And I think this report is setting forth a very intelligent and feasible way for Europe to be able to address that impact that comes from gas imports. So as Europe moves forward, we very much look forward to seeing the European Commission's proposed legislation at the end of this year. We would look to see all of the key elements being, monitoring and verification requirements, leak detection and repair requirements, venting and flaring requirements, all the basic regulatory tools that are necessary to control emissions within the Union. And hopefully, this package would also set the stage for a conversation in Parliament, in Council, about how to address imports. And I would expect that this report that's coming out today would very much inform those conversations. And it's really a credit to my German colleagues for putting this together so nicely. But let me also say that this is a topic that is also very much alive in the United States. So we expect in the United States, probably this week or maybe next week, the US Environmental Protection Agency to itself release a package of regulations that apply to oil and gas operations in the United States. Earlier this year, the US Congress acted to restore regulations on the oil and gas industry that the previous administration had sought to roll back. What EPA will do this coming week or next week is strengthen those restored regulations and expand them. So for the first time, the United States will have national regulations that affect both new oil and gas operations and existing oil and gas operations in a comprehensive way. And we expect those regulations to also address monitoring and measurement and verification, leak detection and repair, venting and flaring, and more. And this is really the foundation. And it's incredibly important for the United States to act here because the United States is the world's largest oil and gas